CJStroud and Bryce Young. One failed and one not only succeeded but blew expectations out of the park. Both were considered to be 1-1, a coin flip to be exact, before they were drafted. But it's not as simple as Bryce sucked and Stroud is good. As usual, there is more to the story. Today we do a deep dive into exactly why Bryce Young failed, looking like a bust, while CJStroud was out there playing like a top 5 quarterback and an MVP candidate. Let's get into it. So we all know by now that quarterbacks need a good supporting cast to succeed in the NFL. And that was the main difference between CJStroud and Bryce Young. We will first look into what the protection was like for each quarterback. And so if we look at the total sacks and pressures allowed by the Panthers, the numbers are pretty rattling. The Panthers allowed 264 pressures, 45 sacks, 31 hits, and 188 hurries according to PFF. This is alarming, but surprisingly it wasn't even more, given the Panthers were on pace to set a record of 340 pressures by week 3. At the time as well, the Panthers left guard Chandler Zavala had a 0 pass blocking grade from the recent game they played against the Seahawks. And important to note, that game Andy Dalton started as well, and the O-line still gave up 36 pressures on Dalton. This gives you the idea of how bad it truly was for Bryce Young starting off. Now looking at the Texans' total numbers for the 2023 regular season, this is excluding the playoffs, we see the protection CJStroud had. The offensive line gave up 30 sacks, 200 pressures, 25 hits, and 145 hurries. The difference of 15 sacks and 64 pressures, which it may not seem like a lot, but in comparison to the rest of the league, it is quite significant. Getting deeper into what the protection was like for both of these guys, we will see something surprising. Again, looking at Pro Football Focus's numbers, which it is the best way to examine linemen, we see the tackles with the Panthers were actually not terrible. Taylor Moton, right tackle, had a 78.7 pass protection grade, only allowing 1 sack and 41 pressures. At the other side with Ike Ekwonu at left tackle, he had a 62.3 grade, having 11 sacks and 44 pressures. That probably wasn't great, granted, as he was graded out to be 45 of 58 tackles who played at least 50% of 1,178 snaps. Now to go to the tackles CJStroud had, we see a similar story actually, arguably worse than the tackles Young had. Laramie Tunsil, left tackle, was elite as usual, posting a 85.4 Pro Football Focus grade. He allowed 5 sacks and only 20 pressures. And to the right side of the line, George Fant was about average, having a 69.4 Pro Football Focus grade and allowing 3 sacks and 30 pressures. You may think, well, that isn't that bad. While both of these guys were injured at various points in the season, and the replacements, well, they look pretty bad. Their replacements, Charlie Heck and Josh Jones, had a 38.9 and a 55.6 pass blocking grade. Both have 1 sack allowed each, 21 hurries, and 27 pressures. So if CJStroud's tackles looked worse than Bryce Young's tackles did, why would the Texans have the better offensive line from the social perspective and the total numbers we had looked at earlier? Well, it's 2 main things. One is the interior offensive line, which was a colossal disaster for the Panthers. And secondly, the Texans had a secret advantage, one that has been taking over the NFL, and can be explained to why the Saints, 49ers, and Dolphins offensive line are still succeeding despite being projected to be a bottom 5 unit. But we will get to that shortly. For now, look at the Panthers' terrible interior. We see the guards were pathetically bad, with Chandler Zavala having a 7 pass blocking grade. That's beyond awful, guys. And we see that in each game he played, besides one game where he was good in only 8 snaps. But he played only 7 games. The other guards looked miserable too, using 9 different guards throughout the whole course of the season due to obviously bad play or injury, and none of them had a better grade than 55.7. And to throw the center Bradley Bozeman under the bus, he was bad as well, surrendering 32 pressures and 8 sacks. Clearly the Panthers interior was honestly an unprofessional mess. I don't get how it could be that bad. Overall, the Panthers guards and the center surrendered 155 pressures and 25 sacks total. If it speaks to anything about the Panthers offensive line, all of them plus the center were ranked in the bottom 200 out of all guards, tackles, and centers in the NFL. Now going through the Texans interior, so we get to the secret of how the Texans O-line was better than the numbers say. There was a little moving around with their guards, and actually the Pro Football Focus grades show each guard and center being similarly graded to the Panthers interior. With the exception of Chandler Zavala, he was a different story. Now the Texans interior surrendered only 95 pressures and 11 sacks, which is a 60 pressure and 11 sack difference, which is huge. So that leaves us with a much better offensive line situation for CJStroud compared to the offensive line sitch for Bryce Young. So why such a difference when their PFF grades were fairly close to one another but the results were night and day differences. Well, earlier I had said there was something special with the Texans offense that provided them a significant advantage over the Panthers offense and really over other NFL offenses as well. That is, the Texans offensive scheme is based on Kyle Shanahan's scheme, which is generally easier on the offensive line regarding what they are being asked to do. Text them even when there are a few bad players. And without going into much detail, because this video would be stupid long then, the Shanahan scheme uses a lot of motion and zone running to exploit defenses. We're using heavier personnel and horizontal pass protection scheme. The offensive line is then protected. This is a very vanilla explanation, but that scheme can take an offensive line with some holes in it and make them look good, which requires the offense to compensate with star talent at the skill positions, which we will talk about later in the video. But that scheme is why the Dolphins of Mike McDaniels and obviously the 49ers with Kyle Shanahan have survived, even though each team doesn't focus a lot of resources on improving their offensive lines and why they're still good despite having multiple weak spots. Speaking of weak spots, there is something that both these guys were terrible at during their rookie campaigns. This isn't surprising for either of them as they both were rookies last year, and that's what tends to happen with rookie quarterbacks. We know now Bryce Young had a bad offensive line in a scheme that wasn't doing it any favors versus CJStroud's offensive line not being great, but having the advantage that Kyle Shanahan's scheme brings to the offensive line. The thing is, both these guys were bad under pressure though. Whether it is making bad decisions, fumbling, or inaccuracy, it certainly wasn't pretty. But we see some interesting numbers as to who is responsible for pressure with the quarterback and offensive line when looking at PFF's allowed pressure statistics. And so, looking at Bryce Young's percentage of responsibility for pressure, he ranked below average with 14.7% of 217 total pressures being on him. Interesting enough, CJStroud was a little worse, having 16.9% of 160 pressures being on himself. But if both these guys are in similar tiers for being a few of the worst QBs for having pressure beat on them, the question is then, what was their performance under pressure? And that's the key difference. If we look at Bryce Young and CJStroud's PFF under pressure grades, we see Young having a 27.6 passing grade, 1 touchdown, and 4 interceptions. Stroud had a 48.3 passing grade, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. But hey, since Stroud didn't throw any interceptions, why was his grade bad then? Well, the truth is revealed with his turnover-worthy plays. Stroud had 8 big-time throws and 11 turnover-worthy plays under pressure, with Young having 5 big-time throws and 14 turnover-worthy plays. Stroud still was a little better in this regard. And not only that, but Stroud was significantly better in key areas, along with an unexpected change, which we'll go into in just a minute. One of the key areas in that he was much better than Bryce is when he was blitzed, having a 69 passing grade versus Young's 48.4 grade. Now, there is a possible reason for Bryce Young's poor play when blitzed compared to just how good Stroud was when blitzed, but of course, we will get into that later in the video. Now, Stroud's excellent performance extends further when being under pressure with a 4-man front. CJ had 20 big-time throws, while Young only had 13. Their PFF grades were polar opposites as well, with Stroud having a 81.2 passing grade and Bryce having a merely 56.8. There is more to the story though. Remember when I said there was an unexpected change? You see, CJStroud was not good under pressure last year until week 10, where his play under pressure drastically improved, going from one of the worst quarterbacks under pressure to one of the best for the rest of the season. So he was ranked 29th out of 37 QBs in the NFL, and that is under pressure, for the first 9 weeks. Then from week 10 to week 18, he was ranked 10th out of 43 QBs, a difference of 24.5 PFF grading points. That is astonishing. For a rookie to do this, even though he has a good situation around him, is unheard of. Look at Caleb Williams so far this 2024 year, and as of recording, this is week 4 by the way, he has one of the best supporting casts for a rookie and doesn't look the part for now at least. And to look back at Bryce Young in the first 9 weeks, he was one of the worst QBs under pressure, bringing out with a 31.2 passing grade. Then getting worse from week 10 onward, having a 28.8 passing grade. Yes, I understand Bryce Young's situation is bad. There's no doubt about it. However, there has been QBs that have come in and looked great despite the supporting cast surrounding them, like Justin Herbert. Herbert coming in as a rookie was insane. His play under pressure was unreal. His offensive line and scheme were trash can worthy, but his receivers were pretty good. Receivers, huh? There is an astonishing difference between Bryce Young's wide receivers and CJStroud's wide receivers. We are talking night and day differences. And I want to start with the X factor, Nico Collins. I am surprised that more people are talking about this guy when it's single-handedly the biggest talking point of why Stroud succeeded. To give a little backstory to Collins quickly, he was drafted at the U of M in 2021. Nico Collins had much potential, but he was a raw talent. It was really unexpected for him to break out even, as at this point in his career, it seemed like he was going to be a wash. Now, Nico Collins didn't just break out in 2023. He had a superstar level season that surprisingly, in my perspective, again, was not being talked about enough. And that's because 1, Stroud was the one taking the headlines by storm, and 2, there is another wide receiver superstar on the team getting the buzz, which we will get to shortly. Now, it is hard to find a complete alpha wide receiver, one that is elite going up against man and zone schemes. How often have you seen a wide receiver go off one game and the next get shut down because they're facing press man coverage? For Nico Collins, man or zone, it was irrelevant to him. His PFF grades show when facing man coverage, he had a 91.6 receiving grade, ranking second of all NFL receivers for man coverage. While versus zone coverage, he had an 86.3 receiving grade. In other videos, a big talking point that I bring up is how vital a wide receiver 1 is for the offense. What they do is force the defense to have eyes on them at all times, since they can beat them at the short, intermediate, and deep parts of the field no matter the scheme. So let's say the defense decides to double cover Collins. Well, Stroud will go to other receivers then. And remember when I said they had another wide receiver who was playing like a superstar? Well, his name is Tank Dell, a player who was unfairly written off due to his size and weight. Now, didn't forget Bryce Young. We will look at how good his receivers were or weren't in just a few. Tank Dell was great against zone coverage, putting up most of his numbers against that kind of coverage. Dell was also Stroud's go-to when Collins was taken out of the game by the defense, and so he had big games then. But then in week 9 against the Buccaneers, he did more damage with 6 receptions and 114 yards. Again, while Collins was only held to 3 receptions and 54 yards. Now, a key note is that this isn't out of the slot. This is on the other side of Collins, a 5'9" receiver that only weighed 165 pounds, which is impressive, even if he wasn't excelling at man coverage like his counterpart Nico. Dell was drafted the same year as CJStroud, and he never was supposed to be as good as he was this past year. How has this contributed to Stroud's success? Well, he had 2 high-level X-Y receivers who are number 1s. And in comparison to Bryce Young, it quite literally is out of this world good. Bryce Young had nobody. Well, he had Adam Thielen, who was a slot receiver for the Panthers after coming from the Vikings. Thielen was actually good to start the season, and I can verify that because he was on my fantasy football team and he was doing pretty good. But there was a problem. Thielen was the only good receiver in the Panthers, but he was no alpha wide receiver 1. This means he wasn't stressing defenses enough at all levels of the field to open up things for the offense. Again, I'm repeating myself, but I have emphasized the importance of a wide receiver 1 and what it does for a QB in the rest of the receiving room. It just makes things so much harder on the offense to not have one. Let's take a look at what they had else then. You see Thielen clearly being the best they have. He had 1,000 yards and had a good grade according to PFF. Important to note, he was their slot guy as well. The other guys did pretty much nothing. Jonathan Mingo was drafted to be DJ Moore's replacement, who they traded away to the Bears to get the draft pick to select Bryce Young to begin with. And if I recall right, they didn't even need to do that. Like when they mentioned putting in DJ Moore as part of the trade to get that pick for Bryce Young, the Bears were like, yeah, we'll take that. Okay, it's hindsight now, but they probably didn't even need to do that. Jonathan Mingo did not grade well, and he had no offensive production despite being on the field at all times. He ended up with only a 52.6 receiving grade, and if that stuff doesn't matter to you, he only had 418 yards, which it does matter then. Ironically, on the side note, Adam Thielen was really good against man coverage, but at zone coverage, he wasn't great. This is ironic because he is an old receiver that was on the decline physically, so everyone was saying. Moving to the next receiver the Panthers had, DJ Chark. He was unimpressive as well, only having 525 yards and a 60 overall receiving grade. There's not much else to say about Bryce Young's receivers. They were just bad. And to look back at the Texans receivers, they were cooking. Even besides Collins and Dell, who had 1,297 yards, that was Collins, and 709 yards, that was Dell. But Noah Brown, their slot guy, had a 75 PFF grade and 567 yards. Robert Woods had 426 yards and a 61.5 grade. These guys alone would beat out Mingle and Chark. And they weren't even the main guys either. And tight end wise, Stroud had Dalton Schultz going for 635 yards, graded out with 72.7. Young had Hayden Hurst and Tommy Tremble, who combined for 378 yards and just were not grading well. This goes to show how important it is to surround your newly drafted QB with a good supporting cast, which is obvious, but the number of NFL teams that draft a quarterback with the expectation that one guy will fix everything is mind-blowing. You would think by now that the date of all people would know by now that it doesn't work like that most of the time. And the Panthers had that expectation of Bryce Young. I'm not quite sure what you could have expected Young to do. Looking back at one of the biggest things I saw between these two guys is something that is debatable, which is the Texans let Stroud cook, and for the Panthers and Bryce Young, they did not. Right off the bat, we saw Stroud just going for it, throwing all over the field, whether it was short, intermediate, deep, it didn't matter. It felt very loose, free, so to speak. The scheme and the coaching let Stroud do his thing. It's like his coaches told him just to go out, sling the ball around, easy plays at first, dumping it around and encouraging him to take those shots downfield. Even if it went poorly, it didn't matter. He's a rookie. Because like many other QBs, such as Mahomes and Tua, they took time in practice, albeit to work on pushing to the limit as much as they can and then reeling it back in, which I feel is what Bobby Slovic, who again is the Texans offensive coordinator, was telling Stroud to do, versus Bryce Young being limited. It felt like he had to play by the rules and only that. Think of it in a way of his coaches telling him to just trust them, to trust the structure of the offense, and it was the we will get to the other stuff later kind of thing. I couldn't find an article that talked about that, but I could have sworn there was a press conference that one was them saying, yeah, we just need to trust the system, trust us. And that's what we're telling Young. And two, which I should have brought up earlier, I could have sworn, I think it was the offensive coordinator or Frank Wright went on a press conference and said they don't want Young going to Adam Thielen as much. They want him to spread out the ball. I could be wrong in that. But I swear they said that. And for me, it's like, you don't have any other receivers. You can't go to anyone else. Like, that's not a realistic option, but you still tell them that. And again, I don't have any verified proof, but I swear, I remember that last year distinctively because I was wondering why Thielen was not doing well fantasy-wise. And I heard that. Are you stupid? He's your only guy. And you're helping me in fantasy, which isn't possible given how bad that supporting cast was. There was not the protection nor the weapons to give the foundation needed to execute that. And I know by now, it's all hypothetical. And maybe as far as we know, Young just sucks and he is a bust, which maybe that's the case. But I struggle with that being the sole answer given the situation and his elite traits, which the Panthers were seemingly not playing into. When he was coming out, he was great at extending the play and going outside of structure. He shined in that role at Alabama. It is what impressed everyone who watched him to begin with, and him quote-unquote being the consensus QB1 over Stroud. But it's actually something that everyone was discussing about Stroud. The question was during the draft time, could he make the out-of-structure plays, and did he have any threat of moving the chains with his legs? And the one time we saw that, where it cleared the air, was the Georgia and Ohio State game in the college playoffs, where we saw, surprisingly, CJStroud do both of these things. Not just a little, but he played lights out. They still lost the game, but that really doesn't matter. We're talking about he showed he can absolutely play out of structure and at a very high level. It's clear the supporting cast was the main driving factor in why Stroud succeeded. It's also true that when he was under pressure, where the play was breaking down, he came through. He was better under pressure. He made a ton of big time throws. The outside of the numbers or in the middle of the field, he was the better quarterback. Bryce Young did not. His situation was horrendous. But when it came down to him, he failed. I hope you guys enjoyed this very long, very in-depth video. Please do like the video. It helps more than you guys think. And comment below what your thoughts are on these two guys. Check out this video as well. We look at the real reasons, besides the obvious, why the Falcons drafted Michael Penix Jr.